Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading in the One-Year Bible. My name is Stephen Mizell. Jay Rivenbark and I are joined by Wendy Korbusieski today, and we're looking at Genesis 41:17 through 42:17. And it's another piece of the story of Joseph, and we talk about how suffering prepares you for leadership, how wisdom allows us to operate during times of abundance, and a little bit about how forgiveness looks as it begins to unfold. So I hope you'll grab your Bible and a pen and paper, and let's have a conversation around the Word of God today. Hey everyone, we're back in the book of Genesis today, the Old Testament reading of our One-Year Bible, and chapter 41, verse 17 through chapter 42, verse 17. And so what's happening here is Joseph is interpreting the dreams. He's predicting the cycles of abundance and famine. And Pharaoh promotes him to second in command. And years later, the famine forces Joseph's brothers to Egypt, and they stand before Joseph. And so was there a piece of this that maybe I haven't asked in a question that we're going to cover that you say I want to make sure we talk about today?
What stood out for me was the fact that the interpretation of the dreams that he made is the thing that got him noticed. But what got him promoted was the plan of action that he put in place. It was the wisdom application of the interpretation. So it was not necessarily the facts. It was what you did with the facts after that. So I just found that very interesting.
From a different perspective than I would normally read this was from a leadership perspective on Pharaoh's part of how he, in this moment, recognizes, okay, this guy is a foreigner. He knows his history. He knows he's been in prison. He knows all those things. But the favor of God is on Joseph such a great way that Pharaoh has the wisdom to say, you know what? This is the right person to put in charge of this job. He's got the skill set, the abilities, and so therefore I'm going to hand this off to him.
That ability to pass off to someone else responsibility, even when they have a sordid past. But you recognize their skill set is it's a hard thing to do. That you're going to put your trust in them. Because at least the prison stay was from what would have been an accusation of betrayal. And I think that could be a real challenging part of the puzzle. So why do you think God allowed Joseph's suffering to prepare him for leadership?
I think we kind of touched on this some in yesterday's conversation. From my point of view, I think Joseph just had some lessons left to learn, especially where humility was concerned. And that kind of suffering is just those fires of refinement that he still had to sit through. It was just some training ground for how to later lead a country. He had to be able to lead in smaller environments in a way with integrity and loyalty and humility in smaller places, and then in the right way in order to do it in bigger ways later.
There are simply some things we will not learn without suffering, without going through difficult times and seasons. And I'm speaking from personal experience, different times and seasons of my own life that the reality is you could put it in paper in front of you, you can read about it, you say, yep, that's a great lesson to learn, but unless there's some suffering or pain attached to it, sometimes you just don't learn the lesson. And for me, the task that was going to be given to Joseph and what God had called him to lead a nation, in reality, really globally because of Egypt's influence at this time, I think the suffering, the intensity of the suffering, and the length of the suffering was proportionate to the task that lay before him. And so if you're going to make that conclusion, you say the longer and the more severe it is, the greater opportunity lies ahead of me for God to redeem this.
I think if you can learn to lead in some of those environments, first he learned to lead as a slave. Then he learned to lead as a prisoner, because the principles are the same no matter where you go. So, I think it's been 2 years now. See, what is this year? Must have been last year. So 2024. A friend of mine who had been in prison for 20 years. We were having a conversation, and he was telling me this. So he was telling me before this, okay, so the way this came about, I was just trying to figure out when it happened, but I'm guessing it may have been late 2023, early 2024. We were having a conversation, and he was telling me how he, while he was in prison, had gotten a hold of some leadership books from John Maxwell, and how they had saved his life. That's how he described it. He said, they saved my life because they taught me some principles that allowed me to navigate people in ways that I never could have navigated them before. And he said, I noticed that the laws of leadership, for example, were present even among criminals, even among thieves, even among the hardest of people. He said the principles worked, right? You could navigate it. And he said, when I say save my life, he said, I literally mean save my life. He said, I've been in prison riots. He said, I've been there in the cell when somebody else was killed. And he said, never one time in 20 years did I have any harm, which was shocking to me, to be honest with you. He said, never one time has anybody ever committed violence to me. And and I said, at that time, I was going to see John in just a few months. And I said, when I see him, I'm going to let him know that. And he said, would you let me write him a letter? And I said, sure. So he wrote a letter. I didn't read it. I have no idea what was in it because it was sealed when he gave it to me. But when I saw John a few months later, we came out of dinner and we were standing outside on the patio. And I said, listen, I've got something, and I just want to tell you before you get it what it's about. And the next morning, I saw him at breakfast, and he said, you can say you believe the laws of leadership work everywhere there's leadership, but you don't see them applied until somebody tells you how they've applied them in prison. Because, and in Joseph's case, the things that he needed to learn to be a good leader, if you can learn those under the hardest of circumstances, it will allow you to flourish when the light is shining the brightest. But if you don't learn those lessons in the hardest of times, when the light shines the brightest, it's going to expose every flaw you've got. Yeah. And he when he got to the big stage, it seems that all of those other things had been worked out of him so that when the light was on him bright, I still think he made some mistakes, but maybe this is a part of God's plan, and we'll get toward that at the end of the story, I guess. But how does Joseph's wisdom during abundance instruct us today?
Those seasons of good and abundance, they aren't times to just sit back and ride the wave. There are moments that you need to think ahead, and you need to plan for contingency. Not too long ago, we read from Proverbs 27:12, and I wrote a small reflection on it about foreseeability is something that Todd says to our kids all the time. That word foreseeability is about thinking about all the, the eventualities of the things that could potentially happen and making provision for that. And this is where Joseph was living. He was living in a season of foreseeability. And I think even operating outside of the dreams of, what he knew, but based on the dream visions that he had received, there was some foreseeability about how to actually put that into practice. How can I practically prepare for what's to come? And so the good lesson for all of us in those seasons of good and abundance. What foreseeability can I apply to my life that can help me prepare for when there's not? Because there will be a whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
We're always riding the wave. There's ups and there's going to be a down. You go up, you will go down.
I think the lesson is during seasons and times of abundance, it does require action instead of apathy. I think the tendency is when things are really good, you just go with the flow and roll with it and enjoy it, and then it changes. When in reality, as we see in his story, the good time, the abundant times were absolutely critical in preparing for the other part of the story on the backside. And I don't think that's a lesson that particularly we as Americans are really good at. When things are good, our standard of living increases, and we're about the moment, the here and the now, rather than looking at abundance as an opportunity for preparing in the future.
Abundant times are the hardest to manage because you need to be doing two things at the same time. And most of the time, people only do one of the two. So my grandfather was a product of the Great Depression. And that cat wasted no money. He died in 1990, and he was still living in it. And I don't mean that in a negative way. He just was.
Yeah.
Every decision he made was based on his experience in the Depression.
Because it could happen again.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
The other end of that is, as you say, in the good times, we just increase our threshold. And the challenge is, so how do you extend? So when you spend it all, it makes the good times more pleasurable. There's no question about that. It also makes the bad times more challenging.
Worse, yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't spend it, right? So in a corporate world, when they have an abundance, if they don't reinvest some of that into R&D, the company's going to run out of product to sell and develop. They're eventually going to die. Mm-hmm. And the hard time's going to come. No matter how much cash they put away, the hard time's going to come, and they're not going to have the ability to recover because cash in a corporate world can't help you recover. It can only help you survive. That's a difference. And so how do you feed the fire so that you can extend the momentum for a period of time while also at the same time securing yourself so that you don't crash and burn? And it's a tension that is very, very hard to manage. I think we either still living in the Depression or we're, burning cash like, we're printing it. And neither are very helpful or healthy. Rarely are we going to be in a situation like he was in, where you have this extreme of abundance and you have this extreme of nothing. But he set himself up. He set the kingdom up. Like this is a whole different theoretical conversation. He set the kingdom up to take all the people's money. That's exactly what happened. I mean, because they brought their livestock. Okay, it belongs to you now. They brought their land deeds. Now it belongs to you. So they owned the grain. That was the first thing. They bought all the grain. Then they owned all the land. Then they owned all the livestock. Then they owned all the people. And essentially all the Egyptians became slaves. That's what happened. And so I think you have to manage that tension in good times and bad. So here we find his first interactions with his brothers. Mm-hmm. What does it reveal to you about forgiveness or about Joseph in general?
When he first saw them, he immediately had to relive those moments of being thrown in that cistern. And later in the story, one of his brothers is recounting how he begged for his life, mm-hmm. how horrific those moments were. All of that had to flash through his mind there. And even in verse 9, it says, but he remembered the dreams. And I think that kind of set the stage for how he was going to choose to react. Because at that moment, I think he had to make a choice how to react based on all the things he's now experienced. He had to choose to react because he's got this flood of emotion racing through about reliving that horror again, facing his brothers, and then remembering the dreams and what put him there, and that pride that got him in trouble, I think, with his brothers. But I think all along in his heart, he has wanted reconciliation and he's wanted to go home because he's dropped some lines all throughout this story that has pointed towards that. Like in 40:15, he even describes himself as not being sold out by his brothers. He described it as being kidnapped, which I thought was, for me, is fascinating. Man, I would have been so angry and have, used a whole different word.
Yeah, but our brain rewires memories.
Yeah. For me, it's like a peek into his heart. Mm-hmm. He's describing it as I was kidnapped and not sold.
Right.
Like my brothers didn't pluck me back out of that. First, they wanted to kill me. Then they were just going to leave me for dead. Then they plucked me out and sold me. No, he just says I was kidnapped is how he described it. So I think things like that is a peek into his heart and saying, I want reconciliation. I want to be reunited with my family. But he was gun shy. He was hesitant. He needed to kind of test the waters. So I think that's where we're sitting right now in that piece of the story. This is what his heart's desire is, but he needs to test and say, okay, if they know who I am, what are they going to do to me next?
Yeah, I think his early reactions ultimately revealed that his love for them is greater than his loss with them. Mm. And I think he's so overwhelmed by emotions that he forces himself to step back, to process, and to try to evaluate the whole situation. I think he's in that moment is struggling with, okay, what's the next step? When do I say something? What do I say? How do I go back to a trick on which he decided to do that? How do I want to approach this? I want to play with him, have a little bit of fun with him, for a while. But ultimately, I think there was a decision early on in the moment that the love's greater than the loss. But how do I process this moving forward?
I think we've all been there. I think he wanted reconciliation. I'm not sure he was wanted to forgive right that minute because he toys with them.
He does.
I mean, he messes with them.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, well, so I have been in some situations where there were people who were not ethical in how they pulled some things off and have had the opportunity to see them in a vice with a squirming. And in my mind, I'm thinking, how you like me now? That's what I'm thinking. And part of me wants to take the trap and I don't want to dismember them or anything. I just want to squeeze them a little bit. How does that feel to you? In the end, I don't think I've ever done that. I don't think I have. I'm not saying I haven't. I can't think of a time where I have. I've usually been able to rise above it, but my first instincts are rarely, I feel sorry for you. Mm-hmm. I don't mean that. Maybe that reveals something about the darkness of my heart. I don't know, but you were fine with him toying with him. So, I think that I don't think it's natural for our first instincts to go, everything's forgotten, guys. Come on in to the palace and we're going to be fine. I think there was some information, and in reality, and I think this is what gets revealed in the end, I don't think his attachment was as much to his brothers as it was to his father. And he wanted to know his father and his brother, his one whole brother, was still alive. And once he got to that point, then I think, we'll see how that plays out. So thank you for joining us again today on One Single Story. Don't forget that wisdom sees beyond the moment and it prepares for what God is arranging ahead. I hope you'll live your life that way. I hope you'll join us again on the next edition of One Single Story.